When Sergeant Nakamura opened his eyes, he saw a white face leaning over him. He waited for the knife. Instead, the man said softly, "Hold still, this might sting a little." For a few seconds, Nakamura couldn't tell if he was alive. The air trembled with heat, the smell of burnt palm trees and gunpowder clinging to his tongue. He tried to move, but his body refused. The field around him was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. A few yards away, a helmet rolled down a slope and stopped beside a boot. Flies were already gathering. The smoke drifted low, covering everything in a gray film. He thought of his unit, the 43rd Regiment, and remembered the shouting, the mortars, the blinding flash. Then nothing. Now, above him, this American, the enemy, was pressing a bandage against his side. The man's hands were shaking, not from fear but exhaustion. His sleeves were dark with someone else's blood. Nakamura saw a small cross stitched onto the man's sleeve. Medical Corps. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a broken whisper, "Finish me." The medic frowned. "No, buddy," he said quietly. "War's over for you." Nakamura didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone, calm, steady, like a teacher speaking to a frightened child. Still, his heart pounded so hard it hurt. He'd been told stories, that Americans skinned prisoners alive, that they cut off ears for trophies. The propaganda had been relentless. His sergeant had sworn, better to die clean than be taken alive. But this man was giving him water. Cold water, from a dented canteen. It slid down his throat, and he coughed, eyes filling with tears. The medic steadied his head, murmuring something that sounded like a prayer. For a moment, Nakamura wanted to bite his tongue, to end it before they could start whatever horror they planned. Yet the pain in his side reminded him, he was still here. Alive. The smell of antiseptic replaced the scent of smoke. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled with static and a voice called out coordinates. The medic moved to another body, American, face down, one arm missing. He stopped, bowed his head for a second, then went back to work. Nakamura watched him, not understanding why the man bothered with the dead, or why he had bandaged an enemy. "You start hating the silence more than the gunfire," another voice muttered from behind. Nakamura turned his head slightly. A group of soldiers stood a few feet away, scanning the field. They were young, faces pale under layers of dust. One of them kicked a rifle aside. Another lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the hot wind. The medic called out, "Got one alive here." The others looked over, surprised. "Jap?" someone asked. "Yeah," the medic answered, without looking up. "Still breathing." A pause. Then, "What for?" "He'd do the same to you." "Maybe," the medic said, pressing another bandage tight. "But I'm not him." The words settled like ash. No one replied. As they lifted Nakamura onto a stretcher, his vision blurred. The sky above was a washed-out blue, empty of planes now. A single bird, a black shape, circled far away. He felt his body sway with each step, the stretcher-bearers grunting under his weight. He wanted to ask why they hadn't killed him. Why the man with the gentle voice had chosen to save him when everyone else was dead. But his throat burned, and the only sound he managed was a dry gasp. They carried him past the wreckage, helmets half buried in mud, a tattered flag caught on barbed wire. A boot with no foot inside. The war had stopped here, at least for now, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhaustion, like the world had finally run out of noise. At the edge of the field, the medic walked beside him. He looked at Nakamura and said something again, slowly this time, "You're gonna be okay." The words meant nothing, but the tone, that human tone, sank deeper than the wound. For the first time since the landing, Nakamura didn't feel hatred. He felt confusion. The stretcher tilted as they crossed a ditch. His head lolled to the side, eyes catching a glimpse of a burning truck, the metal groaning in the heat. Beyond it, a row of tents shimmered through the smoke, white, unreal, like a mirage. That's where they were taking him. He closed his eyes, expecting darkness. But behind his eyelids, he saw the medic's face again, tired, kind, unarmed. A face that shouldn't have existed on a battlefield. Later, the reports would say hundreds of Japanese soldiers were treated after the battle on Saipan. The medical corps recorded every name they could. Some lived. Most didn't. But that day, one medic saved a life, and what he didn't know was that the man he saved would tell a story Japan had forbidden to exist. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Back home, surrender was shame. On the island, it was survival. Before Nakamura ever saw an American face, he'd been taught that surrender was worse than death. At 16, in a school north of Osaka, his teacher had pointed to a map of the Pacific and told the class that Japanese blood was sacred, that capture meant dishonor to one's ancestors. On the walls, posters showed smiling soldiers dying with grenades pressed to their chests, captions declaring, "Better a glorious death than a coward's life." Nakamura remembered the sound of drums in the schoolyard, the smell of chalk and sweat. He'd stood in line as an officer handed out wooden rifles, shouting, "The Emperor watches even from heaven." Boys laughed nervously, trying to look brave. A few months later, those same boys marched to the train station with real rifles, and their mothers bowed so low their foreheads touched the ground. By 1943, the empire was bleeding. Yet every broadcast spoke of victory. Radio voices told them the Americans were monsters, giants with red hair and teeth filed to points, who drank the blood of prisoners. Newspapers described how captured soldiers were mutilated, paraded like animals. The stories were absurd, but repetition made them truth. Nakamura's father, a veteran of Manchuria, said little. Once, after too much sake, he muttered, "They fill your head with honor so you don't notice you're just meat." The next morning, he apologized to his son and burned the comment in silence. When the orders came to ship out, Nakamura's mother gave him a silk cloth with her name sewn in one corner. "To wrap your ashes," she said. He didn't laugh. None of them did. Then came Saipan, the noise, the heat, the endless bombing. When the Americans landed, the officers told them, no surrender. No retreat. Every man carried a grenade for himself. The civilians too were told to die, mothers clutching babies, old men with bamboo spears. On the third week, food ran out. Water was collected from shell holes. The smell of rot clung to every breath. One night, Nakamura watched from the ridge as dozens of civilians walked toward the cliffs. A woman was singing, a lullaby, before stepping off with her child. The splash below came too late to stop her. He wanted to scream, but his voice was gone. Later, his lieutenant gathered the few survivors. "When the end comes," he said, "you will make the emperor proud." He lifted a grenade, smiled faintly, and walked into the dark. A flash lit the palm trees like ghosts. By dawn, the sky rained ash. Nakamura's leg was torn by shrapnel, his rifle lost. He crawled through the mud toward the shoreline, half conscious, hearing distant shouts in English. A flare burst overhead, bright and terrible. He expected the next sound to be his death. Instead, there was quiet, a kind of quiet he didn't recognize. The training screamed inside him, "Die before capture." But something deeper, smaller, human, whispered, "Live." He remembered the stories of American cruelty and felt his chest tighten. He found a grenade on the body of a friend, thumbed the pin, and hesitated. He was too weak. The metal slipped from his hand, landing beside him in the mud. He waited for the explosion, but none came. The grenade was a dud. He laughed, a dry, broken laugh, then passed out under the rising sun. When he awoke again, it was under a white sky and an unfamiliar voice saying, "Hold still, this might sting a little." For days afterward, as he lay on a cot surrounded by the hum of generators and the smell of medicine, he tried to piece together how it had happened. How the monster from the posters had become a man with gentle hands. He thought of his mother's silk cloth, folded in his uniform pocket, meant for ashes. Now it covered the bandage on his chest. The American nurses moved between the cots, humming songs he didn't know. They spoke words he couldn't understand but whose tone carried no hatred. It felt like seeing sunlight after being buried. In his notebook, the one he'd hidden in his boot, he wrote a single line in shaky script: "They treat even the enemy like a friend." Maybe we were lied to. That sentence, small and secret, was more dangerous than any bullet. Outside, trucks rumbled toward the front lines, bringing new wounded and new ghosts. Inside, Nakamura watched the Americans pour water for a fellow prisoner, adjusting his pillow as if tending a brother. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But something inside him cracked open, something years of training hadn't reached. The war was still raging beyond the tent walls, but here, for the first time, it felt suspended, like the world had paused to remember what it meant to be human. And so, when the first Japanese POW opened his eyes in an American hospital, he thought he was in hell. The room smelled of coffee, not blood. And someone was humming a jazz tune, low, steady, like a promise that the world might go on. When Nakamura opened his eyes, the light under the tent roof was soft, filtered through white canvas. He thought he'd woken inside a dream. Rows of cots filled the space. Boots lined up beneath them. A nurse with pale hair moved quietly between the beds, her shoes whispering over the dirt floor. She smelled of soap and coffee. When she passed his cot, he shut his eyes and braced for pain. "They flinched when we touched them," an American doctor later wrote. As if a hand meant a weapon. She peeled back his bandage. Nakamura stiffened, expecting cruelty. Instead, she murmured something gentle. Her voice didn't rise like a question, it fell like calm rain. When she smiled, his breath caught. Nothing in his training had prepared him for this kind of enemy. Outside, engines droned, and rain pattered on the canvas. Inside, the nurse hummed the same tune. Across the aisle, an American soldier lay with one arm in a sling, trying to shuffle cards with his left hand. Another patient, Japanese, thin as bone, stared at the ceiling. The air itself seemed confused, not sure who belonged to which side anymore. The medic who had found Nakamura in the field appeared at his bedside. "How's our guy?" he asked. "Stable," the nurse said. The medic turned to Nakamura. "You made it, buddy. War's over for you." Nakamura didn't understand the words, but he felt their weight. The man offered him a tin cup. He tasted bitterness, coffee, and for the first time since landing on Saipan, he didn't want to die. Later, a translator arrived, a Nisei from California. "You're safe," he said in slow Japanese. "Hospital. Guam." Nakamura stared at him. "Why?" "Because you're a patient," the man replied simply. "Not a prisoner. Not today." The words scraped against everything Nakamura had been taught. Better to die than be captured. Yet here, he wasn't dying. He was being healed by the people he was supposed to hate. At night, the generator's hum filled the silence that used to be gunfire. The nurse walked between the cots, adjusting bandages, humming again. When her hand brushed his shoulder, he didn't flinch. The warmth of it stayed even after she moved away. The tent had its own rhythm, soft voices, footsteps, rain, the clink of metal trays. Sometimes laughter rose like a strange bird, fragile but real. The sound frightened Nakamura more than any bomb, it meant life was possible again. Across from him, an American soldier watched the Japanese patients. "Funny," he muttered. 2 weeks ago they were trying to kill us. Now we're tucking them in." The medic beside him shrugged. "We don't treat enemies. We treat wounds. Maybe that's how we win more than one war." The line hung in the air, sharp and quiet. Even Nakamura, who didn't know the words, felt the truth in the tone. Days blurred into a pattern of recovery. Clean bandages. Warm food. The slow return of strength. The nurse smiled when he managed to stand for the first time. His legs shook, but he stayed upright. The tent seemed to tilt and settle around him like a ship finding calm water. He caught his reflection in a polished mess tin, thinner, older, but alive. He thought of the cliffs of Saipan, of the woman who had sung before jumping with her child. He could still hear that song, but now another tune replaced it, the nurse's jazz, light as breath. The translator returned one morning. "Soon, they'll ask you questions," he said. "Officers, historians. They'll want to know what you saw. If you tell the truth, some people back home will call you a traitor." Nakamura looked down at his hands, wrapped in clean gauze. "And if I lie? Then the war never ends," the translator said softly. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight pressed through the canvas, bright enough to make the coffee steam shimmer. For the first time, Nakamura felt warmth without fear. One of the men in that tent, no one knew which, not then, would later testify. And his words would reach farther than any bullet Japan had fired. "They were feeding the wounded, the enemy, before they fed us." That was the first thing Private William H. Carter wrote in his letter home. He'd been on Guam for only 3 weeks, yet what he saw inside that hospital tent would stay with him for life. Rows of men who tried to kill them, now lying side by side with Americans, wrapped in the same white bandages, breathing the same air of uneasy peace. The order had come down quietly, no guards, no rifles inside the wards. Just doctors, nurses, and medics. Psychological adaptation, the brass called it. Carter didn't know what that meant. He only knew the Japanese prisoners wouldn't touch their food. They watched every movement, eyes sharp as razors, certain the soup was poisoned. "They looked terrified even when we brought them food," he wrote. "When I said, 'You're safe,' one started shaking and bowed, again and again." The first morning, a nurse left a tray by each cot. Hours later, the soup was cold, the rice untouched. A corporal from Minnesota tried to show them it wasn't a trick, took a spoonful himself, smiled, and said, "See? Good stuff." It didn't help. 90% of the prisoners refused to eat for 2 days, waiting for the poison to work. Nakamura watched through half-closed eyes. The nurse came again, knelt by his bed, and broke a biscuit in half. She ate one piece, left the other on his pillow. It smelled faintly of butter. His stomach ached with hunger, but pride held his hand still. When she turned to leave, he whispered, "Domo." It was the first word he'd spoken in days. Across the tent, a Japanese sergeant with his leg in a cast whispered to his friend, "If my mother saw this, she wouldn't believe me." The tent had grown quiet, a silence thicker than fear. You could hear every metallic clink of instruments, every drop of rain hitting the canvas. That silence wasn't the kind that came before death anymore. It was the kind that let you breathe. Carter moved between the beds, replacing bandages. He'd stopped thinking of them as enemies, they were just bodies needing repair. One man had burned so deep the skin shone like wax, another had a bullet wound clean through his shoulder. Carter treated them as he treated his own men, even when some of the Americans muttered, "Why waste morphine on them?" He'd answer without raising his voice, "Because we can." That answer quieted them. Not convinced, just quiet. By the 4th day, hunger broke through pride. A few prisoners began to eat, timidly at first, then faster, as if racing against shame. Nakamura took a sip of broth. The salt stung his mouth, tears followed without warning. The nurse thought it was pain, but it wasn't. It was disbelief. Outside, the jungle shimmered under the heat. The war still roared somewhere beyond the horizon, but in this patch of earth, men were learning how to exist without shooting. The interpreter, the Nisei corporal, explained softly, "You are safe here. No one will harm you." Some didn't trust him, others nodded faintly, as if pretending to. But a few began to look around, noticing details they hadn't before, the smell of coffee, the sound of laughter from the next tent, the way Americans talked about home as if such a thing still existed. That night, Nakamura lay awake listening to the soft buzz of the generator. A moth circled the bulb, tapping against the glass again and again. He thought of Saipan, the cliffs, the fire, the screams that had ended midair. He thought of the faces of men who'd chosen death before capture. And he wondered what they would say if they saw this place, this impossible peace built on pain. The next morning, something changed. One of the American medics, his hands still wrapped in gauze, stood in line with a tray. The cook was late, and food was scarce, but when the pots came, the officers ordered, "Feed the prisoners first." Carter hesitated, then followed orders. The sight of it, bowls of rice and soup being carried to the Japanese cots before any American had eaten, pulled a strange hush over the tent. No speeches, no cheers. Just the sound of spoons and shallow breathing. A young American whispered, "They're feeding the Japs before us." The medic beside him replied, "Yeah. Guess Mercy doesn't have a queue." In one corner, the nurse from Minnesota helped a prisoner sit up. The man bowed weakly, murmuring, "Thank you," in fractured English. She nodded, adjusting his pillow, and for a heartbeat, there was no enemy between them, just exhaustion, and the small miracle of survival. Outside, the rain had stopped. The island steamed, heavy with new growth. Inside, the silence returned, not heavy now, but fragile, like something you didn't want to break. The men who lived through that week would later say it was the first time they saw peace take shape, not as a treaty or a flag, but as the simple act of feeding a stranger. But the real shock came a week later. When they saw who the Americans buried, and how. They buried Japanese soldiers under the same flag, folded, saluted, and played the same song. The rumor spread through the camp before sunrise. A burial detail was forming near the ridge, 3 Americans, a chaplain, and 2 prisoners chosen to carry stretchers. At first, no one believed it. The Japanese POWs thought it must be a punishment, or perhaps a trick. But when the interpreter explained that the ceremony was for both sides, silence fell heavy as stone. By mid-morning, the heat pressed down like a wet cloth. A rough clearing had been turned into a graveyard, neat rows of wooden crosses, each marked with a name, rank, and date. Some were American. Others bore hand-painted kanji, black ink still damp from the brush. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. The chaplain, an older man with tired eyes, stood at the center. He held a small Bible in one hand, his other resting on a folded American flag. Around him, soldiers removed their helmets. The prisoners watched from a distance, uncertain if they were allowed to move closer. When the ceremony began, no one spoke Japanese. But grief didn't need translation. The bugler raised his instrument, and the first notes of taps drifted over the graves, thin, trembling, impossibly human. Even the wind seemed to stop. Nakamura stood near the edge of the field, one hand gripping the rail of his crutch. He saw a stretcher pass, carrying a body wrapped in white cloth, a Japanese corporal he'd known from the hospital tent. The man had died 2 days earlier from an infection. Now, Americans were burying him with the same ritual they used for their own. He turned to the interpreter. "Why?" he asked quietly. The interpreter hesitated, then nodded toward the officer overseeing the burial, Captain Miller, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his jaw. Miller knelt beside the grave, smoothing the cloth over the dead soldier's chest. When the chaplain finished his prayer, the captain said simply, "He was a soldier. That's all that matters." Those words traveled farther than any gunfire ever could. After the flag was lowered, 2 men stepped forward, one American, one Japanese, and filled the grave with earth. The sound of shovels striking dirt echoed in the still air. No one moved until the last clod fell. For the first time, the prisoners saw Americans bow their heads. Not in victory, not in dominance, just in respect. When the service ended, the chaplain handed a small wooden marker to the medic, Carter, who placed it at the head of the grave. On it, someone had written the dead man's name in rough, careful kanji. It was crooked, but legible. A Japanese sergeant whispered to his companion, "Why would they honor the dead of their enemies?" No one answered. As the crowd began to drift away, Nakamura lingered. The interpreter waited beside him until he finally said, "In our army, we burned our own. No graves, no names. Only smoke." The interpreter nodded. Maybe this is another kind of victory. That afternoon, the prisoners asked permission to return to the site. They carried small scraps of paper, folded carefully, each with a red circle drawn in ink, not the flag of the emperor, just the symbol of the sun. Carter, now guarding the supply tent, watched them approach and asked, "What do you want those for?" The interpreter explained. Carter hesitated, then called to his commanding officer. The captain considered a moment, then said quietly, "Go ahead." The prisoners walked slowly between the rows of crosses, placing their paper suns at the base of each grave marked with Japanese script. They worked without speaking, their movements careful, reverent. When the last flag was laid, one of them bowed toward the horizon, as if addressing someone far beyond the ocean. Photographs exist, grainy, sun-faded images of that day. You can see Americans standing back, helmets off, arms crossed. You can see the Japanese prisoners, heads bent, the paper flags trembling in the wind. The war looked different in that light, less about sides, more about what survived between them. Under the Geneva Convention, the U.S. command had ordered that the enemy who dies in captivity shall be buried with dignity. It sounded bureaucratic on paper. But on that ridge, it became something living, a rule turned into mercy. In the following weeks, more burials followed. American and Japanese graves alternated like the steps of a shared heartbeat. By August, over 300 Japanese soldiers had been buried with military honors on Guam. Their names, where known, were recorded in ledgers, where not, they were marked simply as unknown. At night, the wind from the ocean carried the faint sound of taps back through the camp. Some of the prisoners would stop what they were doing and listen, not out of obedience, but because the song no longer sounded like an enemy's hymn. It sounded like an ending they could understand. That night, Nakamura couldn't sleep. The image of the folded flag stayed with him, not the stars or stripes, but the hands that had held it, the way they treated the dead as if rank and language no longer mattered. He sat up on his cot, staring at the shadows on the tent wall. Then he whispered to the interpreter, who slept nearby, "Do you have paper?" The man blinked, half awake. "Paper?" "Yes." "And a pencil?" The interpreter handed them over. Nakamura smoothed the sheet across his knee, the lantern light trembling beside him. He hesitated for a long time, then began to write, slowly, carefully, as if the words might break the silence. "Mother, they did not kill me. They healed me." That was the first line Nakamura wrote. The pencil trembled in his hand, the paper soft and thin like skin. Outside the tent, the jungle buzzed with night insects, and the faint hum of the generator gave rhythm to his thoughts. The war was still burning somewhere out there, but in this small circle of light, there was only breath, ink, and silence. He had not written Japanese words in months. His hand felt foreign to his own language. Each stroke of the brush-like pencil felt like an apology to everything he had once believed. He began slowly. "Dearest mother, I do not know if this will ever reach you. They told us that capture meant shame, that Americans drink the blood of prisoners. But they gave me milk. They called me, sir. Maybe everything I believed was a lie." He paused, reading the words twice. His throat ached. The interpreter, sitting across from him, kept quiet. He was only there to help if Nakamura asked. The camp's single lantern flickered between them, making the shadows sway like ghosts. Nakamura continued. "I remember how you bowed when I left. You said, 'Die well, my son.' But death never came. The man who found me gave me water." His hands were shaking, but not from hate. "Mother, they heal even their enemies here. They bury them with songs. If you saw it, you would cry too." He stopped again, looking at the paper as if it might vanish. Around him, most of the prisoners were asleep. A few whispered quietly, trading cigarettes for news, or murmuring prayers. Somewhere near the entrance, a guard laughed at a joke told in English, the sound sharp, distant, but harmless. The interpreter leaned closer. "Do you want to write more?" "Yes," Nakamura whispered. "But I don't know what I am now." The interpreter nodded. "Maybe that's what you write." And so he did. "I was told to be proud, to never kneel. But I have knelt here, in front of kindness. They treat me as if I am still human. I don't know what that means anymore. I'm sorry, Mother. I'm sorry for what I thought." He signed his name and folded the letter carefully, as if the act itself might carry it across the ocean. He handed it to the interpreter, who promised to show it to an officer for review. They both knew what that meant: censorship. No letter that spoke of mercy, of humanity in the enemy, would ever reach Japan. Still, Nakamura smiled faintly. "Then maybe someone else will read it," he said. Days later, Sergeant William Carter, the same medic who had found him in the mud, came across the letter while sorting papers for translation. He was struck by its tone. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't guilt. It was something quieter, disbelief turning into faith. Carter kept a copy in his kit, later calling it, the only war souvenir that didn't hurt to look at. In an official report dated August 17, 1944, an Army intelligence officer wrote, "Recovered correspondence from Japanese POWs suggests emerging cognitive dissonance, disbelief in propaganda narratives. Recommend inclusion in reorientation study." The letter was labeled "Example of Moral Conversion," File RG 389. It never reached Japan. But its words traveled in other ways. The interpreter shared lines with other prisoners, quietly, during meals or before lights out. Each time, the story shifted. "They gave me milk. They buried our dead. They said war is over for you." The word spread like rumors of mercy. That week, Nakamura was invited to write again, not a letter this time, but a statement for the camp's new reorientation program. American psychologists were testing whether kindness could rewrite belief faster than fear. They asked simple questions: what do you think of America now? What do you wish for after the war? Most prisoners didn't answer. Nakamura did. He wrote, "I wish to understand the silence." The officer reading the translation frowned. "What silence?" The interpreter smiled faintly. "The one that comes after the noise." That night, Nakamura watched as rain began to fall, drumming softly on the canvas roof. The paper flag he'd placed at the graveyard earlier that week had likely turned to pulp by now. Still, the act of laying it down felt more real than any oath he had taken for the emperor. He thought again of his letter, folded somewhere in a file marked classified. He imagined his mother opening it, reading the words that told her her son was still alive, and that her country's truths were not. He imagined her crying, not from shame, but from relief. The lantern flickered once, then died. In the dark, someone whispered, "Gomen," again and again, the Japanese word for "I'm sorry." Nakamura didn't know who it was. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe every man in that tent could have said it. Sometimes the loudest sound of war is a single word, sorry. But when the war ended, and they returned home, Japan wasn't ready to hear the truth. "When I stepped off the ship, my mother cried. But not from joy, from shame." The docks at Yokohama were silent that autumn morning in 1945. The air smelled of salt and coal dust, and the sky hung gray over a country that had lost its voice. The men stepping off the repatriation ships wore the same blank expression, not pride, not relief, just the dull disbelief of those who survived something they weren't supposed to. Nakamura carried a small canvas bag, his name still written in English from the POW camp. The guards at the port checked papers, stamped them, waved the men through. No one said welcome home. No one clapped. Civilians watched from the edge of the pier, their faces tight, their eyes avoiding the returning soldiers. One of the men whispered, "They look at us like ghosts." He wasn't wrong. The empire had fallen, and the soldiers who came back alive were reminders of its failure. In the new silence of defeat, there was no place for men who had surrendered. When Nakamura reached the edge of the crowd, he saw his mother waiting. She was smaller than he remembered, her kimono faded, her hands rough from work. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she began to cry, softly, behind her sleeve. When he called to her, she turned away. That night, sitting on the tatami floor of their narrow home, she finally spoke. "They said you were dead," she whispered. Maybe that was better. His father didn't speak at all. He sat by the window, a cigarette burning down between his fingers, and when he finally looked up, he said, "You should have died with honor." Then he stood and left the room. The words landed harder than any bullet. In the weeks that followed, Nakamura learned what the war had left behind: burned cities, rationed rice, silence where laughter used to live. Former soldiers gathered in parks, their uniforms patched and faded, eyes hollow. Some carried placards asking for work, others simply stared at the ground. The government offered them no medals, no pensions. Those captured by the Americans were erased from records altogether. On official forms, prisoner of war was not a category, it was a stain. According to the Ministry of Welfare's post-war reports, more than 40% of returned POWs hid their status even from their families. Nakamura soon understood why. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid him. Old friends turned their backs. Once, at a food line, a stranger spat at his boots and muttered, "You came back because you were too weak to die." He stopped telling people where he had been. At night, he dreamed of the camp, the white tents, the smell of coffee, the sound of English words he still didn't understand but somehow missed. He'd seen humanity there, from the hands of men he'd been told were monsters. Now, among his own, that warmth felt like something forbidden. One evening, he found his old diary, the one he'd hidden during the war. Between the stained pages was the letter he'd written to his mother but never sent. "They did not kill me. They healed me." He read it twice, then folded it again and placed it inside a drawer. Some truths, he thought, belonged only to the silence. Years passed. He found work at a dockyard, loading cargo for American ships, the same flag that had once terrified him now painted on crates of canned milk and fabric. The irony tasted bitter. He kept his head down, spoke little. People said he was quiet because he had seen too much. They didn't know it was because no one wanted to hear what he'd seen. When veterans met in bars, they told stories of bravery, of last stands and glorious deaths. Nakamura stayed at the edge of those conversations, sipping his drink, listening to men who still believed that dying had been the only way to win. If he tried to speak of mercy, of the nurse who had tied his bandage with shaking hands, the table went silent. One man once said, "You talk like an American." After that, Nakamura said nothing more. His mother grew old and never mentioned the day at the dock again. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't watching, she would look at him with something softer than shame, maybe forgiveness, maybe confusion. But they never spoke of Guam, or the war, or the letter. In 1947, officials visited former POWs, asking for written accounts of their captivity. Nakamura declined. Others lied, saying they had never been captured at all. The truth had become heavier than the uniform they no longer wore. He lived quietly, built small things with his hands, wooden boxes, fishing rods, a life made of repairs. But at night, when the wind came off the harbor, he sometimes heard taps in the distance, the ghost of that bugle on Guam. And he remembered the burial, the folded flag, the words of the American captain, "He was a soldier." That's all that matters. If Japan had taught him anything, it was how to die with honor. America had taught him something harder, how to live with mercy. But mercy had no place here. Not yet. He kept the letter. He kept the silence. And yet, years later, long after the docks had been rebuilt and the flags changed color again, one of those men finally broke the silence. He decided to tell the truth. And his words would hit Japan like an explosion. "I saw the enemy's mercy. And it hurt more than their bullets. By the 1960s, Japan had rebuilt its cities, but not its memory. Concrete towers rose where ashes had been, and people spoke of the future as if the past could be paved over. Factories hummed, radios played jazz from America, and schoolbooks told cleaner stories, stories without hunger, without surrender. But one man couldn't forget. His name was Tadao Ishigami. Former lieutenant, Imperial Army. Captured on Guam in '44. He'd spent years pretending those months had never happened. Until the day he turned 60, when the silence began to feel heavier than the shame. That spring, he sent a letter to a radio station in Tokyo, polite, formal, nothing sensational. He said he wanted to speak about what war took and what mercy gave back. The producer almost threw it out, but something in the handwriting caught his attention, precise, old-fashioned, disciplined. They invited him for a short interview. The program aired on a Sunday evening. The host introduced him as a veteran of the Pacific Campaign. Ishigami sat stiff in his chair, wearing the same jacket he'd worn to his son's wedding. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone. "We were taught that Americans are beasts," he began. "That capture was worse than death. But when I was wounded, they gave me morphine, and a blanket. A soldier named Carter, I never forgot his name, carried me through the mud. He saved my life. And I have spent 20 years trying to understand why." The studio went silent. Even the sound engineer stopped breathing for a second. The host cleared his throat. "Lieutenant, are you saying the enemy showed you compassion?" "Yes," Ishigami said simply. "And that was the hardest thing to survive." The phones began ringing before the broadcast ended. Some callers praised his courage. Others shouted that he was a disgrace. One woman's voice cracked with anger, "My husband died with honor. You lived with shame." Another man said quietly, "I thought I was the only one." The next morning, Asahi Shimbun ran a headline, "A soldier who speaks of kindness, is he still a soldier?" The photo showed Ishigami mid-sentence, eyes lowered, like a man confessing. Letters flooded in, some calling him a traitor, others thanking him for saying what they couldn't. One note read, "In the camp on Saipan, they fed me before their own. I thought it was a trick. Now I know it was mercy. I have never told my wife." Another said, "You gave me back my memory. I am not alone anymore." By the end of the week, the Ministry of Information had called the station. The recording was pulled from re-airing. Officially, the reason was unbalanced historical representation. Unofficially, no one wanted a story where the enemy acted human. Yet copies of the interview spread quietly, on reel tapes passed between veterans, in university clubs, in whispered retellings over sake. People remembered certain phrases like "wounds," "they gave me morphine." "They called me sir." "They buried our dead with honor." In 1963, a magazine began publishing a serialized column titled "Voices from Captivity." The editors received over 200 submissions from former POWs, each one describing something Japan had never allowed, that the Americans had treated them as men. Censors cut entire paragraphs, labeling them psychologically destabilizing. But fragments still appeared, enough to spark arguments in cafes and classrooms. A professor of ethics at Kyoto University wrote an essay defending Ishigami. "To acknowledge the enemy's humanity," he wrote, "is not betrayal. It is maturity." For that, his funding was suspended. The backlash grew until Ishigami himself vanished from public view. He refused further interviews, refused to publish a book, refused to let his children speak about him. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, had already begun. The story had escaped into the bloodstream of the nation. One journalist later tracked him down to a small apartment near Osaka. When asked why he'd spoken out, Ishigami answered without hesitation, "Because I saw mercy. And mercy asks to be remembered." The reporter asked, "Do you regret it?" He thought for a long moment. "Every day," he said. "And yet, I would do it again." Because if they were monsters, his voice faltered, but he finished the sentence anyway. Then who were we? The words hung in the air, heavy, unanswerable. That question outlived him, spreading across a generation that had inherited silence. In classrooms and veterans' halls, the younger Japanese began to ask their fathers and grandfathers what really happened on those islands. Some answered. Most didn't. But something had shifted. The myth had cracked. And in that crack, between guilt and gratitude, pride and truth, a new story began to take shape. He lived another 40 years. But the moment that haunted him most, was the hand that saved him. In the winter of 1984, an old man sat by a window in Osaka, watching the snow gather on the narrow street below. His name was Tadao Ishigami, though few still remembered it. On the table beside him lay a stack of yellowed papers, notes from a memoir he would never finish, and a single envelope stamped from the United States. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the signature at the bottom made his hands tremble. William H. Carter, M.D. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The letter was short, written in neat blue ink. To my patient from 1944, I hope life has been kind to you. I still remember that day on Guam, and the look in your eyes when you realized I wasn't going to hurt you. I've wondered for years if you survived. If you did, please know, it mattered to me. Dr. William Carter. Ishigami set the letter down, his breath shallow. Outside, a child's laughter echoed faintly in the street, the sound both near and impossibly far. He hadn't heard that name in 4 decades, yet it felt like yesterday, the smell of rain on canvas, the sting of antiseptic, the voice that said, "Hold still, buddy." That voice had followed him through nightmares, through silence, through the long years when mercy had no place to live. His son, Hiroshi, found him sitting at the table, the letter open in front of him. "Father, who is it from?" he asked. Ishigami smiled faintly. "From a man who once saw me as a man. Not an enemy." They sat together for a long time without speaking. Then the old soldier began to tell his son the story he had buried for half a lifetime, the battlefield on Saipan, the white tents on Guam, the nurse who hummed jazz while changing bandages. He told him about the burial under the shared flag, about the night he wrote to his mother but never sent the letter. Hiroshi listened, wide-eyed, as if hearing a secret history of the world. When his father finished, he whispered, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because mercy," Ishigami said, "is hard to explain to those who never needed it." Later that week, he wrote back to Carter. His English was slow but careful. "Dear Doctor, I lived. I had a family. I built ships instead of destroying them. I often thought of your face. I want you to know, you saved more than my life. You saved what was left of my faith in people." He signed it, then hesitated before adding a single line at the bottom, "War made us forget who we are. Mercy reminded me." He sealed the envelope and handed it to his son. "Post it for me tomorrow," he said. That night, sleep came gently. In his dreams, he stood again in the hospital tent, younger, whole, the nurse pouring coffee into tin cups, Carter smiling faintly as the rain drummed overhead. The smell of gunpowder was gone. Only the sound of breathing remained, not enemies, not allies, just men alive. He died 2 months later, the letter already halfway across the Pacific. When it arrived in a small town in Illinois, Dr. Carter's wife opened it. The doctor had passed the year before. She read the letter anyway, folded it carefully, and placed it beside a photograph of her husband in uniform, standing under the same white tent that had once divided and united 2 worlds. Years later, historians would find both letters, Carter's and Ishigami's, in separate archives, joined again by accident. They became part of an exhibit titled Mercy in the Pacific, Unlikely Stories from War. Visitors often paused before the glass case, reading the faded lines aloud. Some wept. Some simply stood there, silent. One young visitor, an American veteran from another war, left a note in the guest book, "We were taught to kill quickly. No one taught us how to heal." Maybe that's what victory really means. Another, a Japanese student, wrote in English, "My grandfather never spoke about his scars. Maybe now I understand why." The museum guide later said that people lingered longest at that exhibit. Not because of the relics, but because it forced them to imagine a moment that shouldn't have been possible, compassion in the middle of a slaughter. For decades, nations had written their histories in blood and triumph, measuring worth by what was conquered. But between those two letters, one written by a medic, one by his enemy, history found something smaller, quieter, and far more lasting. History remembers battles won by fire and steel. But sometimes, victory begins with a bandage. Outside the museum, snow was falling again, the same kind that once covered Osaka, the same that might have touched Guam's hills before dawn. Soft as ash. Bright as forgiveness.